There are forces moving through a life long before the person living it becomes conscious of them. An inherited idea of love, a childhood definition of success, a fear absorbed so early that it no longer feels like fear, a manner of speaking, choosing, pleasing, withdrawing, pursuing, enduring. 1,000 small impressions accumulate until they become a character, and eventually, the character begins to speak with the authority of destiny. This is how the invisible acquires power, not through force, through familiarity. What we encounter repeatedly becomes normal. What becomes normal becomes unquestioned, and what remains unquestioned can eventually be mistaken for truth. A person may therefore spend years making apparently deliberate decisions while being carried by a current they have never stopped to examine. They choose the familiar kind of relationship and call it attraction. They pursue the familiar kind of achievement and call it ambition. They protect the familiar wound and call it caution. They repeat the familiar sacrifice and call it love. The current does not need to deceive us. We participate in our own enchantment. Yet not every unconscious form is an enemy. Beneath conscious thought, there may be conditioning, imitation, and inherited fear. But there may also be instinct, memory, embodied intelligence, an old capacity waiting to be reclaimed, a desire that existed before approval taught us what to want. The unconscious is therefore not something to conquer. It is something to become intimate with. Sovereignty does not mean silencing every force within us. It means becoming conscious enough to discern which forces deserve our obedience. There is nothing inherently wrong with repetition. Civilization itself depends upon it. We learn language through repetition, craft through repetition, ritual through repetition. Love, discipline, and character are all strengthened through what we repeatedly practice. The danger begins when repetition continues after its purpose has disappeared. When yesterday's adaptation becomes today's identity. A strategy that once protected you can become the very limitation from which you now need protection. A loyalty that once preserved belonging can become a betrayal of your own nature. A desire that once gave direction can continue long after the destination has ceased to matter. A role adapted for survival can eventually be mistaken for the self. This is why unconscious living can be so difficult to recognize. It does not necessarily look chaotic. Often it looks remarkably coherent. The days function. The explanations make sense. The person can account for every decision, yet there is a difference between a life that is coherent and a life that is consciously chosen. The question is not whether you have been shaped by your history. You have. The question is whether your history is still entitled to decide your future. Which parts of your identity were discovered and which were assigned? Which desires arose from your own depths and which were cultivated by the approval of others? How much of what you call preference is simply what you have become accustomed to receiving? What have you mistaken for personality because it has been repeated for so long? What would you no longer choose if nobody were watching? And what would you choose if you were no longer required to remain loyal to the person you once had to become? There comes a moment when these questions cease to be philosophical. Something that once seemed inevitable becomes questionable. A familiar path loses its authority. A desire reveals itself as borrowed. A relationship exposes the pattern it has been repeating. A decision long postponed begins to feel less like a decision than an overdue act of recognition. Nothing outside you may have changed, and yet the current has become visible. That is the beginning of freedom. Not freedom from influence. No human being is free from influence. Freedom begins when influence becomes visible enough to be examined. And perhaps this is the first movement of sovereignty. Not to command every current, but to know what is moving you. The ancient question is therefore not merely, where am I going? It is more demanding, what is moving me? Before changing the direction of your life, learn to recognize the force that has been giving it direction.